Have you ever felt like you're constantly battling on your own? No matter how hard you try, the weight of the world seems too heavy to carry alone. But what if the secret to peace and victory isn't in your struggle, but in surrender? What if the battles you're fighting could be won by simply stepping aside and letting God take control? It sounds impossible, right? Yet time and time again, Scripture reveals a powerful truth. When we stop fighting, God steps in and does what we can't. In this moment, it's time to ask yourself, are you ready to let go and experience the miraculous? Keep reading, because the life-changing transformation that awaits might be more than you ever imagined. Have you ever had one of those days when everything feels like it's spiraling out of control? You wake up with the weight of the world on your shoulders, and no matter how much you try to push forward, things just seem to get worse. You think to yourself, if I could just control this, maybe it would all make sense. The truth is, we all face that struggle, believing that if we could just manage things a little better, plan every step, and control every outcome, we would find peace. But here's the harsh reality. Control is often an illusion. From a young age, we're taught to strive for control, to make plans and achieve goals. Our culture encourages it. We want to be the masters of our own fate. But as Christians, we know deep down that no matter how much we plan, how much we try to control, we're never really in charge of the bigger picture. Think about it. We make plans for our careers, for our families, for our futures. But at any moment, life can throw a curveball. Unexpected health issues, relationship struggles, financial burdens, things we didn't plan for. It's in these moments of uncertainty that we realize the truth. We're not really in control. And in many ways, it's a struggle that keeps us awake at night. The more we try to control, the more out of control we feel. Take a look at the story of Abraham. God promised him descendants as numerous as the stars, yet after years of waiting, he took matters into his own hands. When his wife Sarah couldn't have children, Abraham listened to his wife's suggestion to have a child with her maidservant, Hagar. While this decision was made with the intent to fulfill God's promise, it led to strife and conflict, ultimately causing pain and division in his family. Abraham's attempt to control the situation only complicated it. It's easy to point fingers at Abraham, but in truth, many of us do the same thing. We know that God has promised us peace, guidance, and provision, yet we often find ourselves acting out of fear or impatience, trying to control the outcome on our own. We want certainty, and when God's timeline doesn't align with ours, we feel compelled to take matters into our own hands. But as we see from Abraham's story, this often leads to unintended consequences. The reality is, we were never meant to bear the full weight of control. God never asked us to manage every aspect of our lives. Yet how many of us find ourselves carrying the burden as if we could? It's as though we're trying to steer a ship through a storm with our bare hands, and each attempt makes the waves stronger. But here's where the good news comes in. We don't have to do it alone. In Matthew 11:28, Jesus invites us with open arms. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus is offering us a way out of the exhausting cycle of control. He's offering us rest, not just physical rest, but rest for our souls. It's a kind of peace that transcends understanding, a peace that comes from surrendering our need to control everything and trusting Him with the outcome. When we look at our lives through the lens of surrender, we start to see things differently. We realize that peace doesn't come from being in control, but from trusting the one who holds the entire universe in His hands. So, what happens when we stop fighting to control every detail? What does it look like to truly let go and let God lead? In a world that champions independence, surrender is often misunderstood. It's seen as weakness, as giving up, as losing the fight. But in the kingdom of God, surrender is not weakness. It is where true strength begins. It is in surrendering to God that we find our greatest power, because it's not our own strength that sustains us, but His. Imagine standing in the middle of a battlefield, weapons in hand, prepared for the fight. Now, imagine lowering your weapon and walking toward your opponent, not in defeat, but in trust. This is what surrender looks like in the spiritual sense. It's not about giving up. It's about acknowledging that the battle is no longer ours to fight. Take Jesus' own example. In the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before his crucifixion, he was in agony, fully aware of what lay ahead. In Luke 22:42, he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Even though Jesus was in deep distress, he surrendered his will to the Father, knowing that God's plan was greater than his understanding. He chose to trust the Father, even in the darkest moment of his life. Jesus' surrender wasn't a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate act of trust. In surrendering, he allowed God to carry out a plan that would bring salvation to the world. Through his submission, Jesus overcame the greatest battle of all, death itself. In our own lives, we are often reluctant to surrender. The world tells us that we must fight for our place, that we must earn everything ourselves. But what if the real victory lies in letting go of the need to control and trusting God to fight our battles for us? The Bible tells us in Exodus 14:14, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Imagine that. God is ready to fight on your behalf, but all he asks is for you to be still and trust him. Surrendering is an active decision. It's not about passivity. It's about choosing to place our trust in God's ability to fight for us, instead of relying on our own strength. Surrender frees us from the burden of having to make things happen ourselves. When we surrender, we open the door to God's transformative power. 2 Corinthians 12:9 reminds us, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" It is in our weakest moments, when we realize that we can't do it alone, that God's power is most evident. This doesn't mean that life will be free of struggles. Surrendering to God doesn't magically remove challenges, but it changes how we face them. It gives us the strength to stand in the storm, knowing that we are not standing alone. It gives us peace that passes understanding, because we no longer feel the pressure of needing to control every outcome. Think about the example of just David and Goliath. David didn't fight Goliath with sword and spear. He surrendered the battle to God, trusting that God would deliver him. In 1 Samuel 17:45, David boldly declared, "You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." By surrendering the fight to God, David won not just the battle, but his future. In your own life, what would happen if you stopped fighting battles that aren't meant for you? What would change if you surrendered your struggles, your pain, your fear to God, trusting that he will fight for you? The power of surrender is not about letting go of control for the sake of laziness, but letting go of control so that God can work in ways that you never could. It's one thing to surrender to God, but it's an entirely different challenge to trust him with the battles you're facing. The real test of faith is in those moments when the storm is raging, the winds are howling, and everything inside you screams, "Take control. Do something." Yet in those moments we are called to trust. What does it mean to trust God with your battles? It's not simply about hoping things will get better or praying for relief. Trusting God in battle means giving him full permission to direct the course of your life, to intervene in ways you can't even imagine, and to lead you to victory, even if you don't understand how or when it will happen. Consider the story of the Israelites in the wilderness. For 40 years, they wandered in a desert, facing physical hunger, thirst, and enemies on all sides. Yet, time and again, God showed himself faithful, whether it was by providing manna from heaven or parting the Red Sea. In Exodus 14:14, as Pharaoh's army closed in on them, Moses declared, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." The Israelites faced an impossible situation, trapped between the sea and the Egyptian army. But God's plan for their deliverance was far greater than they could have envisioned. When they trusted him with their battle, God parted the Red Sea, and they walked to safety. How often do we forget that the same God who parted the Red Sea is still at work today? The battles we face may look different: health struggles, financial difficulties, broken relationships. But the truth remains: God is still the same. And when we trust Him with the outcome, He can work in ways that exceed our understanding. Trusting God isn't about being passive. It's about active faith. It's about stepping out, knowing that God will fight for you. Think about David and Goliath again. As a young shepherd, David didn't have the armor or the sword to fight Goliath, but what David had was an unshakable trust in God's ability to defeat his enemy. In 1 Samuel 17:46, David boldly declared, "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head." David trusted that God would give him victory over a giant, even when everyone else saw him as unfit for the battle. In the same way, you may be facing a giant right now. It may seem impossible, insurmountable, but the key is to stop trying to fight the battle in your own strength. Trusting God with your battles means letting go of the idea that you have to solve everything yourself. It means stepping into the fight with the confidence that God is with you, that He will deliver you in His time, and that His plan for your victory is far greater than anything you could ever imagine. Proverbs 3:5-6 reminds us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." It's not about understanding how the battle will be won. It's about knowing that God's plan is perfect, even when we don't see it. Trust doesn't mean the absence of fear. It doesn't mean that you won't feel overwhelmed. But it does mean that despite the fear, you choose to believe that God's strength is greater. It means choosing faith over fear, peace over panic, and confidence over confusion. It's walking forward, step by step, in the direction God leads, even when the path seems unclear. So, what does trusting God look like in practical terms? It means praying over your battles, giving God permission to act on your behalf. It means being still enough to hear His voice, allowing Him to guide you through each decision. And it means holding on to His promises, trusting that He is always faithful to fulfill them. Have you ever experienced a moment where you simply let go and let God take control? It's a terrifying thought for many of us, handing over the reins to someone else, especially when we've spent so much time trying to steer our own lives. But the truth is, when God takes control, everything changes. The weight of our fears, our anxieties, and our limitations are replaced with His peace, His wisdom, and His unshakable strength. It's easy to say, "Let God take control." But what does that really mean? It means letting go of the illusion of control we've been holding on to so tightly, and allowing God to lead us into places we never thought we'd go. It means trusting His plan, even when it doesn't make sense in the moment. Take the story of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers. At first, it seemed like everything was falling apart: his dreams, his family, his future. Yet when God took control of Joseph's life, He turned what seemed like hopeless situations into platforms for His glory. In Genesis 50:20, Joseph declared to his brothers, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." What appeared to be a disaster was actually part of God's perfect plan. Joseph didn't understand it at the time, but he trusted that God was in control. And in the end, his story became a testament to the truth that when God takes control, He can bring good even out of the most painful circumstances. Now think about your own life. How often have you been in situations that seemed impossible? Maybe you faced betrayal, loss, or rejection. It's easy to look at those circumstances and feel like everything is falling apart. But what if God is using those very moments to fulfill a greater purpose? What if the chaos in your life is actually the prelude to a breakthrough? When God takes control, He can turn our mess into a masterpiece. It doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't always happen in the way we expect. But one thing is certain: when we surrender to Him, we're giving God permission to work in ways we can't even fathom. Consider the example of Paul, who faced countless trials, beatings, imprisonments, shipwrecks, and more, all for the sake of the gospel. In 2 Corinthians 12:39, Paul shares God's response to his plea for relief from a thorn in the flesh. "But He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Paul's hardships were not removed, but he came to understand that God's strength was made perfect in his weakness. When God takes control, our weaknesses become the stage for his power to shine through. God's control in our lives is not about removing all difficulties. It's about knowing that he is working through them. It's about realizing that even in the midst of our struggles, he has a purpose. This mindset transforms how we face every battle. Romans 8:28 assures us of this truth. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. This is not just a nice promise, it's a certainty. God works in all things, even the painful and unexpected ones. When we allow him to take control, he begins to align every detail of our lives with his perfect will. The outcome might not always be what we expect, but it will always be good, because it will always be according to his purpose. So, how do we know when God is truly in control? The first sign is peace. When we let go of our attempts to control everything, God's peace enters our hearts. We begin to feel a sense of calm in the midst of chaos, a quiet assurance that no matter what happens, God is in control. We may not know how he will work things out, but we trust that he will. And the second sign is direction. When we stop trying to force our own will, we begin to hear God's voice more clearly. The Holy Spirit guides us, giving us wisdom and understanding, showing us the path forward. Sometimes, it's a gentle whisper. Other times, it's a powerful conviction that leads us toward action. When God takes control, the impossible becomes possible. What once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle now becomes an opportunity for God to show his power. And through it all, we are transformed. There's a kind of peace that doesn't make sense, a peace that doesn't depend on the circumstances around us, but transcends everything. In a world filled with chaos, stress, and uncertainty, this peace seems almost impossible. Yet, as Christians, we are promised a peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that is only found when we surrender our battles to God and trust him completely. Philippians 4:6-7 offers a beautiful promise. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This peace isn't the absence of trouble, but the presence of God in the midst of it. It's not about everything being okay or life becoming perfect. It's about finding calm in the storm. The kind of peace Paul speaks of here is not something we can manufacture or achieve on our own. It's a divine gift that flows from God when we choose to bring our anxieties and fears to him in prayer and surrender. Imagine for a moment what it would be like to face the storms of life without the heavy burden of anxiety and fear. Think about the last time you were overwhelmed by work, by relationships, by health struggles, or any number of challenges. What if, in the midst of those moments, you could experience the kind of peace that not only calms your mind, but also guards your heart, keeping you anchored in God's presence? This is what happens when we stop fighting for control and start trusting God to lead us. The peace that comes from letting go isn't just a temporary relief. It's a constant companion that helps us navigate the ups and downs of life. When we trust God with our battles, his peace enters our hearts and minds, keeping us steady and secure no matter what we face. Think of Jesus calming the storm in Jikong, Mark 4:39-40. When the disciples were terrified, fearing for their lives as they sailed across the sea, Jesus stood up and said, "Peace, be still." In that moment, the storm ceased, and there was an immediate calm. But it wasn't just the physical storm that stopped. The disciples also experienced a peace in their hearts that they had never known before. This peace is not the absence of storms, but the presence of Jesus in the midst of them. When we allow Jesus to take control, we experience a peace that can only come from him. It's a peace that assures us that even when life feels out of control, God is still sovereign. He is still working for our good, and he is still guiding us toward the purpose he has for us. But here's the catch. This peace doesn't just show up on its own. We must be intentional about cultivating it. It requires us to present our anxieties and fears to God. It requires us to take our eyes off of our circumstances and fix them on God's promises. It requires us to choose trust over worry and surrender over control. We can't experience this peace unless we are willing to release our grip on the things that are weighing us down. The more we try to control, the more anxious we become. But when we choose to trust God and surrender our fears, His peace enters our hearts and minds, guarding us from the overwhelming forces of anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. The story of Niger, Peter walking on water, provides another powerful illustration of peace in the midst of chaos. When Peter saw Jesus walking toward him on the water, he stepped out of the boat and began to walk toward him. But as he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the waves, he began to sink. It was only when he cried out to Jesus, "Lord, save me," that Jesus immediately reached out and pulled him up, saying, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" Matthew 14:31. Just like Peter, we often begin with great faith, stepping out in obedience, but then we allow the storms of life to steal our peace. When we take our eyes off Jesus and focus on the problems around us, we begin to sink. But the moment we cry out to Jesus, He is there to lift us up and restore our peace. This peace isn't something that can be found in a self-help book or through perfect circumstances. It's found only in a deep relationship with Jesus Christ, where we surrender our worries and allow Him to guide us. The more we cultivate this relationship, the more we experience His peace, even in the midst of life's storms. So, how can you begin to experience this peace today? The first step is to surrender. Surrender your anxieties, your fears, and your need to control everything. Take time to pray, to speak to God, and to hand over your concerns to Him. Remember His promises, and choose to trust that He will guide you through every storm. As we come to the end of this journey, let's pause and reflect on everything we've learned so far. You've heard the call to stop fighting alone, to surrender your struggles to God, and to trust in His ability to fight your battles. You've been reminded that in letting go of control, you open the door to a life of peace, purpose, and divine strength. But the real question is, will you take the next step? The path we've explored together is not easy. Surrendering to God, trusting Him with our battles, and letting go of our fears and anxieties requires courage. It's not a one-time decision, but a daily choice to lean into God's will instead of our own. But I promise you, as you do this, you will begin to see a transformation. The more you surrender, the more you will experience the peace that passes understanding, the victory that only comes from God, and the power that will carry you through every storm. Remember, God's plans for you are far greater than anything you could imagine. His power is made perfect in your weakness, and His grace is more than sufficient to carry you through every trial. You don't have to fight your battles alone. In fact, when you try to fight them on your own, you're missing out on the victory that God has already won for you. Take a moment to think about the battles you're facing today. What is it that you're holding on to so tightly that you feel like you can't let go? What fear or anxiety is keeping you up at night? God is inviting you to surrender those things to Him. He's inviting you to trust Him with your future, your relationships, your health, and your dreams. Isaiah 41:10 says, "So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This is God's promise to you. When you choose to surrender, you are not letting go of control to an unknown force. You are placing your life in the hands of a loving Father who will strengthen you, help you, and uphold you every step of the way. But this journey doesn't end here. Every day is a new opportunity to live out the surrender we've talked about. You will face new challenges, new battles, and new opportunities to trust God. And each time you choose to surrender to Him, you will experience a deeper level of peace, strength, and victory. As you move forward, remember this: surrender is not defeat. It's the path to true victory. It's the moment when you stop fighting in your own strength and start allowing God to fight for you. When you choose to trust Him fully, your life will be transformed in ways you never thought possible. And now, I want to hear from you. What battle are you surrendering today? How has this journey impacted your faith? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Share your story, your struggles, and your victories with me. Together, we can encourage and uplift one another in this journey of faith. If this message has resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who may need to hear this message of hope and surrender. Join the conversation, and let's continue to support each other as we walk this journey of faith together. You are not alone. God is with you, and together, we will overcome every battle, every storm, and every challenge that life throws our way.